Hello and Happy New Year. Don't worry, I'm gonna do a favorites video. It'll be up sometime in January. But there's an order to these things, so today I'll be wrapping up all the books I've read in December. The first book I read in December was The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. This book was first published in 2010, and I think we can say this is already a modern classic in non-fiction, and especially non-fiction on social issues and racism. Since it was written about 12 years ago, I'm not sure if all the information in this book is still up to date, but the book as a whole is still very relevant today. So in this book, the author argues that Black people in the United States have gone through 3 different caste systems. First slavery, then Jim Crow, and currently the incarceration system. She lays out how the current prison system in the US is racist, that the percentage of Black people currently either incarcerated, on parole or in detention is just vastly disproportional. She talks about the role the war on drugs played in that, and how when people are released from prison, they are still effectively an undercast of society. So in a very small nutshell, that's what this book is about. I thought this book was very interesting and very enlightening. Now, part of this was me being someone from Europe, just being absolutely baffled by USA laws and how things work in the US, especially regarding crime and punishment. Just sort of things I've been aware of, but having them explained with actual numbers and actual statistics was just very revealing. For example, just how vastly more severe drug crimes are punished in comparison to other crimes. The sheer number of people who are in prison for relatively, at least in my eyes, minor crimes. Or the fact that in the US you can't vote when you're in prison, and in some states even a period after you've completed your sentence you still can't vote. And I wonder if it's just me looking at the US from an outsider point of view, or whether Americans also see it like that. I don't know. But in some ways it just seems that things the author lays out in this book are just so ridiculously outrageous that it would be almost funny if it wasn't true, and devastating. But having been made aware of this, it made me able to make a bit more sense of the US as a country. Like, reading this made me feel like, yeah, that explains a lot. Yeah, and I think the author just does a great job in taking us through the history of Black people in the US, and explaining just how they went from slavery to Jim Crow to mass incarceration, and how it's a system that upholds itself. Yeah, just really well done. Really a fundamental piece of non-fiction. The next book I read was Open Water by Azumah Nelson. Now, I recently did a reading vlog where I read this book, and in that video I didn't actually tell you what the book was about until about 25 minutes in. So let's start with that now. This is a book about 2 people. They get introduced by a mutual friend at a party, and they start dating and they fall in love. And this book is just basically their relationship developing. There isn't all that much that happens in the way of plot. The plot is not the main focus of the book. This is very much a developing characters, exploring different themes, with beautiful poetic language kind of book. So if you need a book with lots of things happening, this probably won't be for you. However, I love this book. I love the writing in this. It's the kind of poetic literary writing style that could almost get a bit pretentious. And there were maybe one or two sentences where I was like, ooh, that was close. But for the majority, the author got it right. And when this style of writing is done right, I love it. I love it when authors could pick from a million different ways to describe something, maybe a scene or a feeling, or just anything. But they pick their words so carefully, and I put them in this particular order. Yeah, I love to see the craft in that. So the writing is gorgeous, but I also love the themes explored in this book. So the two people whom this book is centered around are both black people, and they are both artists as well. One of them is a photographer and the other one a dancer. It talks about this kinship in the black community, how they have a shared experience being black. It talks about the role art plays in both their lives and how that is a source of joy for them and a place to be themselves for the both of them. And it's about how the relationship between them is very tender and what it means for them both to be vulnerable when this new relationship is both exciting and scary. It just touches on a lot of different things, and a lot of this is very much read between the lines and not always explicitly mentioned. But for me, that's the strength of literature. Yeah, so I think this is definitely worth your time if you like that sort of books. Then I read Feminism is for Everybody by Bell Hooks. Now I picked this book up because I think Bell Hooks is one of those fundamental authors in intersectional feminism, and the Feminist Reading Challenge, which I did in 2022, also had a prompt to read a book by Bell Hooks. So I read this book to lay some groundwork. So in the introduction, Bell Hooks explains that whenever she talks about feminism, she would often get one of two responses. Either all feminists are lesbians and they all hate men, or feminism isn't necessary anymore. So she decided to write a book so that any feminist who came across these responses would have a succinct answer to it. And that is just exactly what this book is. In every chapter she will go into a different area of life basically and explain why feminism is needed in that area, how it can be improved by feminism, and how it is beneficial to a society as a whole, not just women. Hence the title, Feminism is for Everybody. I think this book is a great starting point learning about feminism. It's not really bringing me anything new that I haven't heard or read about before. But I do love that it is just laid out very neatly, very precise, and just have it all put together in one book. Each chapter will give you the basic groundwork and a starting point to explore. Not a book that gave me anything new, but yeah, a great reminder of why feminism is important. Then I read Creatures of Passage by Morowa Yejidé, and this was so good. It's one of those books that I'm afraid I'm not going to quite be able to capture it and explain why I thought it was good, but we're gonna try anyway. So this book is about a woman called Nephthys, and she's a taxi driver, but not a regular taxi driver. She picks up people who are lost in the broadest sense of the word, and helps them find their way again, in a sense. And the people who she picks up don't know she's gonna come, but they are all very relieved when she rolls up in her taxi and she brings them a sense of calm. Now, Nephthys is a bit of an outcast in society. She's an alcoholic and recluse, and that is in a big way caused by the fact that her twin brother Osiris, who she was very close to, was murdered and dumped in a river. And one day her great nephew shows up saying he's been talking to a man by the river and saying the other kids are teasing him for talking to himself. And there is also Amber, that's his mother, and Nephthys' niece, and she's called the Death Witch because she can predict deaths. So this whole family has this connection to death and the underworld, and they are seen as almost mythological figures in their community. And this book as a whole draws a lot on Egyptian mythology, with both Nephthys and Osiris being important figures in Egyptian mythology, and they are both very much connected to myths surrounding death, afterlife, and the underworld. And even though the book is set in a location that is in some ways very recognizable as the US, in a neighborhood that actually exists in Washington DC, somewhere in the late 60s, it also has this very mythological feel to it. In the story they actually talk about kingdoms, and the presidents get referred to as kings. For example, it would say in the future there will be an orange-faced king, which obviously refers to Donald Trump. So the book feels like someone is telling a myth, even though it's set in the modern day Western world. Yeah, I just thought that was so well done. It explores a lot of different topics. I should give you a big trigger warning for child abuse. There's one character in the book who is a child abuser, and the parts where he features are just very unsettling and very chilling. It explores trauma, it obviously explores death and grief, and because the writing had this lyrical, mythical quality to it, it made it possible to take some distance from it, but without diminishing the story. You'd still feel the weight of it. Yeah, I was just really impressed with this. It's the kind of book where I feel like I've experienced a piece of art, where all these different elements come together and just leave you in awe. You know, the kind of book that makes me excited about reading. Yeah, it's difficult to capture why I love this book, but just trust me when I say that this is an excellent book. I also read 1,000 Ships by Natalie Haynes. Now this book tells the story of the Trojan War, told from the women's perspective. So it takes different women, girls, goddesses and other female mythical creatures and tells their story in the Trojan War. Now I'm not super familiar with the Greek myths, but I did still enjoy this and I could follow it easily. But I do wonder if I was a bit more familiar with the Greek myths, I maybe would have gotten more out of this book. Each chapter is a different woman telling her story. You know, some get a bit more time than others, and some of the women we return to throughout the book. And because of that, I did enjoy some of the stories more than others, you know, which I guess is to be expected. But I do love what the author did in giving a voice to characters that are often overlooked. These characters were all you know, the sisters, the mothers, the wives of people who were very important figures in a big war. And I think the strength of the book lies in the cumulative effect of hearing all their voices one after the other. It reminded me a bit of the book Unwomanly Faces of War by Svetlana Alexievich. That is a non-fiction book where the author collects narratives of different Russian women who were part of the Second World War in some way. And even though that book is non-fiction and this is fiction, I found the effect was rather similar in that each of these stories is worth telling on its own, but it is the sum of the stories that makes the bigger impact. So yeah, I thought this was very well done, and I'm definitely not tired yet of the women's perspective of a story that's usually focused on men genre. Then I read this poetry anthology, Resistencia, Poems of Protest and Revolution. Now, I definitely don't feel familiar enough with poetry to be able to properly review this, but I did enjoy the reading experience. It collects poetry from different poets from Latin America, and they are all poems that deal with topics like feminism, climate change, indigenous rights, queer rights, and they often challenge things like imperialism, dictatorships, and inequality. These poems are put in chronological order, in that the first poem is by a poet born in 1889, and the last by a poet born in 1990. And I love how that just sort of creates a narrative throughout the years. I love how this clearly demonstrates how some of the issues this collection explores are unfortunately timeless. As might be expected, I connected more with some poems than others, but as a collection I really enjoyed it. And then lastly I read Tiny Beautiful Things, Advice on Love and Life by Someone Who's Been There by Cheryl Strait. Cheryl Strait is the author of Wild, and for a while she had an advice column in an online magazine. People could write in with their problems or issues they struggled with, and Cheryl Strait would give them advice under the pen name of Sugar. Now this might sound a bit banal, but it is anything but. I thought this was a wonderful book, and I've already been recommending it left, right and center, just because I think it's a book that everyone will get something out of. And not only that, I think you can get different things out of it at different stages in your life. Now the author answers these letters by giving examples from her own lived experience, lessons that taught her, but it doesn't get self-centered. Instead, the advice she gives is compassionate and full of empathy and just very thoughtful. It isn't always easy advice. She doesn't let the people who write these letters off the hook, but you can see that it's done from a place of love and kindness. I think it's a book that can teach you important life lessons, and a book that could be a companion throughout. I was really pleasantly surprised by this book. So these were the last books I read in 2022. I'm going to be filming my reading plans and goals for 2023 soon, and obviously also my favorite books of 2022, which might feature a few of today's books. So stay tuned for those. For now, I'm going to wish you a happy new year and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.